Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up in the programme, as peace talks continue, Russia rules out making any territorial concessions and says that a Christmas truce proposed by Kyiv won't happen unless a full peace deal is signed by then. Plus, in a special debate, we'll be discussing the situation in Venezuela and asking, is President Trump seeking regime change? And are President Maduro's days numbered? Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on Ukraine. And as peace talks continue, the Kremlin has said today that the Christmas truce proposed by Kyiv is going to depend on whether or not a full peace deal is reached by then. Well, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said on Monday that he supported the idea of a ceasefire during the holiday period. But Moscow says no deal would mean no truce. Meanwhile, Russia is also ruling out making any territorial concessions in the talks aimed at ending the war. Those latest comments come as European leaders weigh up whether or not to agree to the use of frozen Russian funds to compensate Ukraine. Let's get more now. We can speak to William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine, who joins us now from Washington. Ambassador Taylor, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. President Trump says we're closer now than we've ever been to a deal to end the war. And I want to start by asking you if that's the way things look to you and how you rate the chances of a deal by the end of the year.
Tom, we might be closer than we've ever been before, but I'm not sure we're close because I'm not sure the Russians are ready. The Russians need to be pushed. They need to be pressured. Putin needs to feel the pressure from the United States and Europe to come to a deal. I've seen no indication that he is. Now, that said, I do believe that the unity or at least the close to consensus among the Ukrainians and Americans and Europeans is probably better than it has been before. I mean, they've clearly spent a lot of time together over the past week. And I think the American negotiators, for example, are now better understanding where the Ukrainians are coming from, and they understand the strong support that Ukraine has from Europe. So in that regard, those three are getting closer than ever before.
Right, so the cracks that appeared to exist in the unity of the Europeans and the Americans, let's say a week or 10 days ago, you're saying are less present now than they were?
I think so. They're not eliminated because there's still debate on a couple of issues between the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Americans. So it's not quite there in terms of 100% agreement. But it's certainly better than it was, as you say, a week and a half ago. They've spent a lot of time together. They've exchanged ideas. They understand. I think the Americans, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and the others that are there in Berlin, I think they understand where the Ukrainians are coming from and how strongly the Ukrainians feel about prevailing, about not going under the thumb of the Russians.
Right. So, I mean, Zelensky's in the middle of, on the one hand, the Europeans saying don't hand over anything, the Trump administration saying hand over swathes of your territory, and he's having to choose who he listens to. And you're saying that perhaps they're coming from perhaps less extreme positions now than they were, the two sides.
Zelenskyy has been very clear. Neither he nor, more importantly, the Ukrainian people are at all interested in handing over territory to the Russians. Now, that said, President Zelenskyy and probably many, not all, Ukrainians are willing to acknowledge the fact that the Russians illegally occupy 19% of Ukrainian territory. That is, Ukrainians understand that the Russians are there. They're in Crimea, they're in Donbass, they're in 19% of the Ukrainian territory, and they'd be willing to, not willing, they can accept that the Russians are there temporarily. The Ukrainians will never give up, Tom, this is an important distinction, the Ukrainians will never give up claim to that 19%, legal claim to that 19%. That's internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, and the Ukrainians are not going to give up claim to that. They will acknowledge, however, the fact that the Russians are there temporarily. And the Ukrainians hope that at some point in the future, probably not by military means, they'll get it back.
Doesn't Zelensky face the risk of a massive backlash within Ukraine if he signs off on a document, were such a document to exist, and we're still not quite sure on the legalities of it, but signing off swathes of his country's territory?
Not only a backlash, President Zelensky will not do that. He doesn't want, that's not good for the country. Ukrainians will not accept it. He understands that. He won't accept it. So I don't think I don't think he's giving a thought to signing over legal claim to that territory. I don't think it's there.
And what about the chances of Zelensky being replaced in the weeks or months ahead? I mean, the United States was sounding like it wanted Ukraine to hold an election a few days ago. We haven't heard quite so much about it in recent days. Why does the US think it's necessary, given the current situation in Ukraine, for there to be an election?
That's a Putin talking point, Tom, as you've reported. Putin has been on that line for a long time.
So why has it become a Trump talking point?
It came because he was asked the question and he blurted it out. That I don't believe, as you say, that we haven't heard much of that lately. And the reason is the Americans have talked to the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians have explained. President Zelensky has said, look, I'm going to go for elections sooner or later. I'm going to go for elections when the fighting stops, when it's secure enough to have an election, when it's secure enough to have a campaign, when it's secure enough for soldiers on the front line to come back and vote, when it's secure enough for people lining up at polling places not to be targeted by the Russian bombs. When that happens, then President Zelensky has said, am happy to go for elections. He's ready to do that. And I think the Americans understand that now, while the Russians bombard cities over and over every night, daily, now it is impossible to have elections. So that's just, it's not an interesting topic to have elections right now for the Ukrainians. And I think the Americans are beginning to understand that. The Europeans understand that well.
The Russians have made another pronouncement today. They've said they won't make any territorial concessions, whether it's Donbass, Crimea, or Novorossiya. They're not going to give up any territory at all, they've said. I'm not sure how much territory they've been asked to give up. But while we're on the subject of concessions, I mean, up until this point, can you identify a single concession that's been extracted by the Witkoff-Kushner team from the Russian side?
None. I can't identify anything that the Russians have been asked to give up. The Russians invaded nearly 4 years ago. I keep track. It's like 1,392 days, Tom. 1,392 days ago, the Russians invaded, and they've been invading and bombarding and killing Ukrainians, civilians as well as military, for nearly 4 years. And so they've been asked to give up nothing. And as you just said, the Ukrainians are being asked to give up territory, to give up claim to their legally blessed, internationally recognized territory. So no, I don't see anything that the Russians are giving up. They just need to stop this war. And in order to get them to get there, we need to put pressure on them.
Right, pressure on them. And yet a lot of the pressure seems to be on President Zelensky. For example, President Trump said a couple of days ago, aiming his comments at President Zelensky, when you start a war, you better make sure you've got enough missiles and you can win it. But President Zelensky, by most people's account, didn't start the war. Why do you think there's a misunderstanding at such a high level in the United States about the very basics of who started this war and why?
That was a while ago, Tom. Let's be clear. President Trump may have said that a while ago. No one believes that. As you say, no one believes it. The Russians understand who started this war. They admit it. No, there's no confusion by anyone, on anyone's part, about who started this war. It's clearly the Russians who began it, unprovoked. They can stop it, but they need to feel the pressure. They need to feel the pressure. And President Trump has leverage. He can bring that pressure economically, financially, militarily, politically. He can put pressure on Putin to stop this war. He just needs to decide to do that.
Okay, well, one thing that's changed in the last few days appears to be the US position on security guarantees for Ukraine. There seems to be a bit of a breakthrough here and a sort of what's been described as an Article 5-like guarantee. How would that work? Why is that significant?
It's very significant. It's very significant. What that would say is the United States, presumably supported by the Europeans, would recognize an attack on Ukraine by the Russians as an attack on the United States. That's the Article 5 commitment that underlies the NATO treaty and other treaties that the Americans have with other nations. So that would be very important. That's a strong signal to the Russians not to attack again. If there is a ceasefire, or if the fighting stops and the security guarantee goes into effect, passed by the Congress, by the way, supported and legalized and ratified by the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress, that is a legally binding commitment by the Americans to come to the defense of Ukraine, just as if the United States were attacked by the Russians. So that's very significant. And the Europeans are eager to join that commitment.
Okay, I mean, let's start looking at what happens next. I mean, the revised version of the peace plan is now going to be presented to the Russians again with this security guarantee contained therein. What happens if the Russians just say no? There's no way we're going to sign a deal that looks like that. Where does that leave President Trump's negotiating team?
That leaves President Trump with the decision to put pressure on Putin to change his mind. The Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans will be united, as we've talked about. They will present that unified front proposal offer to the Russians. And if the Russians turn it down, then President Trump and the Europeans will have to put pressure on Putin to come around. And as I say, military pressure, long-range weapons, these Tomahawk missiles that the Americans can provide to the Ukrainians can go deep into Russia and disrupt their attacks on Ukraine. There are more sanctions to cut off the funds going into the Russian economy and the Russian treasury and that fund the war machine. The Europeans are about to make a decision on this $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves, make that available to the Ukrainians to keep them going for 3 years. All of that will demonstrate to Putin that he can't wait us out. He can't wait the Americans out, the Europeans out, certainly can't wait the Ukrainians out. Once he understands that, he's going to have to come to the table and make a deal.
Yeah, I mean, not all of the European countries are in favor of those billions of Russian euros being confiscated, so to speak, and given to Ukraine. What does the United States think about that issue? Does the US encourage the Europeans to go ahead and basically seize those assets?
Some of the early proposals drafted by the Russians, by the way, had other uses in mind for that $300 billion. So in this early so-called 28-point plan that was drafted by the Russians, given to Steve Witkoff, in that 28-point plan, there showed up some ideas about how to use that $300 billion for joint projects with Americans and Russians. That's now been scrapped. The Americans have not come out strongly in favor of using that $300 billion, and they don't have to. The Americans don't really have a claim. They have maybe $5 billion in American banks that they can do something with. But the bulk of those $300 billion is in Europe, and the bulk of that is in Belgium, and the bulk of that is in Euroclear. And so that is where the decision is made on the use of this $300 billion.
Right. I mean, the Belgians and the Italians seem to be amongst those expressing most concern and most unease about seizing that money. Just to sort of bring this conversation to a conclusion, Ambassador, I mean, does it sound to you, does it look to you like the Russians want peace, or do you think they would rather fight on, at least in the medium term, and take more territory?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're exactly right, Tom. That's what they want to drag it out. They want to take more territory. They want to continue to kill Ukrainians. Putin has said he doesn't think Ukraine's a real country, and he's happy to overtake it, to absorb it into Russia. That's what he's been doing. He's given no, as we talked about earlier, there's no indication he's ready to sit down and make a deal until and unless President Trump puts real pressure, tough pressure on Putin to come to the table. That's what it's going to take. Otherwise, Putin is not interested in negotiating, compromising, or ending this war.
And just lastly, Ambassador, I mean, I know you've visited Ukraine recently and you've served there as ambassador and you know the country well. And I'm just wondering on your latest visits, whether you've detected any dip in morale, if you've noticed any change in the resolve of the Ukrainian people and their government.
Tom, the Ukrainian people have been battered for 4.5 years and 3.5 years, coming up on 4 years. And the attacks on the energy system, on the electricity and gas and even the nuclear distribution, they are going without electricity and heat and light for many hours a day, even in Kyiv, around the country. So they are tired and they are angry. So in answer to your question about morale, they're determined that they won't give in to the barbarians, the Russians. They will not give in to the Russians. They will continue to fight. They are tired. They want this to end. And they want the Americans to put pressure on Putin to make it end.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth are holding closed-door classified briefings today for all 100 US senators on the situation in Venezuela. It's expected this will be followed by a briefing to the House of Representatives. Well, during the last 3.5 months, Washington has ordered more than 20 deadly strikes on boats off the coast of Venezuela, and there's been a significant buildup of US military force in the Caribbean. Well, the Trump administration says this is an armed conflict with drug cartels and accuses the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, of playing a role in supporting illegal drugs, which kill Americans. This is something the Venezuelan president denies. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who was awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize, says she absolutely supports President Trump's strategy. And she says that Venezuela ought to be a top priority for US national security.
And a lot of the Venezuelan drugs come in through the sea, so you get to see that. But we're going to stop them by land also.
So what are President Trump's intentions? Where could things be heading to from here? And which countries would come to Venezuela's assistance in the event that the situation escalates? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined today by two guests. We're joined by Diego Sequeira, a Venezuelan journalist who joins us from Caracas. We're also joined by Dr. David Ramadan, former Republican representative for Virginia and professor of political science at George Mason University in Washington. Thank you both very much indeed for coming to see us. Let me start by asking you, Dr. Ramadan. It's been reported that the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth are holding this closed-door classified briefing for all senators, and that'll be followed by another briefing for all representatives today about strategy towards Venezuela. What do you think is about to happen?
Good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me. The question here is, will there be a ground invasion or ground military operation or not? And that is most likely why the administration is updating Congress today on what is happening. In order for the President of the United States to use any ground troops, it is pretty much agreed upon in the legal community that he will need Congress to approve that. He does not need Congress to approve the water attacks and the limited operations that are taking place today as part of the war against narcotics or to stop narcotics from getting into the United States. But any land incursion or any land operation that involves U.S. troops will require Congress approval. And that's why today it is reported that Secretary of State Rubio and Secretary of War Hegseth are on Capitol Hill, updating and informing members of Congress of both the Senate and the House of the situation on the ground, possible options, what the U.S. can and not necessarily planning, but the options for the U.S. president. I do not believe that the U.S. president has made any decisions at this point beyond the increased pressure and the increased sanctions and the continuation of targeting small boats as they are smuggling narcotics, and the sanctions or the extension of sanctions by grabbing U.S. tankers under the U.S. sanctions. I'm sorry, Venezuelan tankers under the U.S. sanctions. So all options are on the table. It is a tense situation. It is escalating, but the exact intentions are not determined yet.
Okay, thanks for that. Diego, let me turn to you. What we're looking at here is the largest U.S. regional military presence in decades. What does this look like to you there in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, I think Mr. David is right regarding what this possible meeting could be about, especially because I don't think the uniformity of, well, the narrative so far has been successful, and you have a significant pushback by Democrats in Congress and the Senate, and some Republicans. So it makes sense in that way. Also, well, from the ground, I mean, you don't see, like I've been stressing this for many times in several interviews, and you don't see any kind of social breaking point going on. People still are more concerned about the holidays, are more concerned about making the money for the festivities, and perhaps, a bit more uncomfortable now that we learned that, for example, that the Baseball Caribbean Series, which were supposed to be held in Caracas in February, for the time being are being withdrawn by three of the countries, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. But up to this point, I still believe it's more about ramping up pressure and trying to make things happen from within in order to make it easier for regime change. And still, I think it's about regime change. I think the narrative of the narcotics has been not successful. And you even got Susie Wiles just now stating to Vanity Fair that this is not about drug indictments, this is about pressure. So I think it is part of the process. And maybe I could also add that precisely because of the narrative hasn't been so successful, they're shifting it in order to make sense. And yes, the recent seizure of a tanker shows also that the economic features of this are like the most important, precisely to try to achieve that breaking point inside Venezuela.
Okay, you're saying it's not happening yet. Let me ask you, Dr. Ramadan, I mean, does this look to you like President Trump wants regime change there in Venezuela?
I don't think that that's a mystery. I believe he does. However, that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen. Even though that would be the preference of President Trump today, unannounced preference to have a regime change and get rid of Maduro, he is still open for negotiations. President Trump is a transactional guy, always has been, always will be, and he has requirements, and he's got a set of conditions that he would like to see in Venezuela. Including how does that affect the United States on immigration issues, on drug issues, and how does that affect the region in the hemisphere? The United States is very interested in recalculating its position in that area of the world. So if Maduro comes to the table with agreement to what Donald Trump wants, then he could likely survive this, and there would be no regime change. But is it the preference of the United States or President Trump? I don't think that's hidden at all. He never said it per se, but yeah, he would prefer to get rid of Maduro.
Okay, and I mean, let me just stay with you for a moment, Dr. Ramadan, because I mean, if this does develop and escalate into a conflict, I'm wondering how that's going to go down in the United States, especially from President Trump's support base, given that he campaigned on a platform that would be more about ending wars than starting new ones. What are your thoughts?
For his base, for the MAGA segment of the Republican Party, and for the Republican Party overall, he can do whatever he wants and he gets away with it. It's as simple as that. He said at one point during one of the campaigns that he could walk out on Fifth Avenue, shoot somebody, and still get the support of his base, and that is absolutely true. There may be some rumblings here and there, but he will have the absolute support of his base because he can justify it for them based on this narrative of drugs and security and immigration in the United States, which the base supports 100%. That does not necessarily mean it's going to play well for President Trump with independents, and certainly not with the Democrats. With an upcoming midterm election in 2026, there's a debate here. Does this help the Republicans that are quite behind in public opinion and likely are about to lose Congress, or does it hurt Republicans in Congress? In general, in traditional wisdom here, conventional wisdom says that normally when you have a war, America gets together and that supports the war president. I don't think that's going to play well this time, especially because he came in as anti-war president and now he's narrating it this way. So the political factor outside of his base will not be helpful. But politically within his base, within the Republican Party, he'll have an absolute support by Republicans.
Okay, Diego, let's talk about Mr. Maduro's support base, because we've heard quite a lot from the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, and we'll talk more about him in a bit. But what he said is that a conflict in Venezuela would see Venezuelans joining together in support of President Maduro. Do you agree with that? And just tell us how popular you think President Maduro is in Venezuela right now.
You know, I do agree with President Lukashenko, and I also, to some extent, agree one more time with Mr. David. Maybe some slight difference on some of the elements, but you have to keep in mind that one thing is support for President Maduro, and another one is support a military incursion of sorts against Venezuela. This goes beyond the Chavista base. This actually touches a very well-rooted nationalism here that doesn't. Regardless of what the political take is, they won't accept and won't celebrate, other than a small faction, any kind of external violent means to ensue some sort of regime change to realign the country to U.S. strategic interest. So yes, also this kind of situation also helps Maduro in the sense that it is the typical rally around the flag situation, maybe at some point very proactive, as he still has a very strong base. And but this also adds up to people who don't agree with this kind of situation. It would rather find any kind, if there's a problem, any kind of internal political resolution.
Okay, but Diego, let me just put this to you, because I mean, looking at the stats about Venezuela over the last 2 decades, I mean, it's gone from being a wealthy petrostate to being a country that has teetered on the brink of social and economic collapse. And some other facts are, it's ranked as being the 9th most corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. Unemployment is pretty acute, the 2nd highest murder rate in the world, high infant mortality. Why do President Maduro's supporters continue to support him?
I think first of all, you have 2 things here. Those seems to be outdated numbers in many aspects. And also you have the spin that's usually the case with the NGO industrial complex and others. And also it's very important to realize how much the causes are being blurred of what actually happened and why Venezuela has gone through so much, especially the last decade, 12 years or so. So it's not as easy as fitting the narrative outside of Venezuela and what we have been going through here, and what many things have actually improved, especially the last 4 years, economically speaking, security-wise, and otherwise. And that doesn't mean, of course, that Venezuela is in a rosy picture and everything is perfect and wonderful. It isn't, of course. but it has a normalcy that it's quite better than it was, yes, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, which was really, really tough. That's true, but we are actually far from that. And you can see with precisely, for example, the numbers that regarding oil production, or even the current economic figures, including, for example, its inflation, which was like a staple reference. I mean, yes, 5 years ago, and this is acknowledged by the Venezuelan central bank, inflation reached 130,000%. And this doesn't happen organically. This has also external factors operating in there. And now it's tamed to single numbers, single digits. There are important problems. One of them, economically speaking, is precisely the value of the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, which it's still plunged, and it's problematic on a daily basis. But still, people who are here are very able to manage and live through a normal life, regardless of the stressful situation it can become sometimes. So it's not that picture, which of course it's useful for many things, especially procedural things. It's not the actual reality. Although at this point, it's not even a concern to shift that perception, because it's pointless if you really are convinced and need to be convinced of these numbers and these stats and so forth. Transparency International, of course, does this, but it's funny how they also focus mostly on the global South countries and don't do anything about structural corruption. We can talk about for example, the drug trafficking. Talk about how much that drug money goes through the financial system, so through very respectful financial entities, and that's nothing that's actually clearly addressed. So that also explains this. And above all, talking about narratives and talking about making it viable for the people inside the United States to think it's worthy, that it's justifiable to start proper kinetic military operations inside Venezuelan territory. You have two factors to home in here. One of them, of course, it's the polls. I know at least 3 polls recent from last week's, from 4 to 5, 3 weeks, that actually, one, they see through the narrative. They don't believe that this is something that's going to improve their lives. Second, they don't believe it's true. And third, they don't support war. And that's also, by the way, it's symmetrical to the polls that you can find inside Venezuela. So, and you have another factor that I think is far more sensitive, and of course I think the US government is aware of. It's what happens with the energy uncertainty and suddenly a surge on the WTI and then finally on Brent, and what's going to mean that in the cost of fuel inside of the United States. And these are factors that are going to actually affect mostly the base of the United States, especially the fuel factors. So this brings the other variants that need to be analyzed. It goes beyond whatever political or other ideological interest there might be behind this. And when I say ideological interest, I'm not thinking about President Trump. I'm thinking more about Marco Rubio and the Southern Florida politicians inside Congress, by the way.
Okay, Dr. Ramdan, feel free to respond to any of that. But since we've mentioned narcotics more than once in this discussion already, I want to ask you how sure you think the Trump administration is that there is compelling evidence that Venezuela is indeed, as it seems to think, either a transit country or a producing country of narcotics, or both.
They're 100% sure that it's both, and that has been shown to members of the administration, or proven by the members of the administration and shown to members of Congress. So the question of are they carrying drugs or not is not an issue. That the administration is pretty, and the intelligence is pretty sure that that's the case. And ideologically here, this is not a matter of ideology. This is a matter of national security strategy. President Trump, Marco Rubio, Secretary of War, this administration believes that this Western Hemisphere is a priority. They do and believe that they need to counter the threats that's coming into the Western Hemisphere from external powers such as China, Russia, Iran, and that they have to secure their grip on the region. They see Venezuela Venezuela as a conduit for that. They see Venezuela as a point of entry for these other powers into the Western Hemisphere, and therefore it is quite important whether we use the drug narrative as the entry or whether we use any other narrative as the entry, that the United States absolutely must impose its hegemony, its influence on this region, and Venezuela needs to come in line. So it's up to Maduro. Does he change his tactics or change his positioning and back down from making Venezuela a point of entry to foreign powers into the area that are enemies or adversaries of the United States? Or does he not? And if he does not, then there's likely going to be a regime change, or at least an attempt for regime change by the United States, period.
Diego, let me turn to you on the subject of narcotics. It's been reported that 2 of President Maduro's nephews were arrested on charges of conspiring to bring 800 kilos of cocaine into the United States. Let me ask you about that. And very simply, do you believe, I think I know the answer to this, that Venezuela is a narco state? And is President Maduro the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, or the Cartel of the Suns? How do you respond to all of that?
Well, first, let's go through the data. Let's talk about the UN Drug and Crime Organization, the World Customs Organization, and even the DEA. At least the 2024 report of the DEA, there's a single mention of Venezuela. They do acknowledge, and so does the Venezuelan government, that Venezuela could be a transit route depends on the stats. It's from 5 to 8% of the transit route into. Not even straight into the United States, but into Central America and other crossings into the United States. So that's one of the elements. Now, regarding the Cartel de los Soles and the whole narco state narrative, I think first if you know the origins of the Cartel de los Soles, where it actually started, you have to head back to 1993. Far before the Bolivarian Revolution reaching to office, and see that it was precisely the National Guard General Ramon Guillén Dávila, who was actually working with the CIA, who was then arrested, indicted, and processed, and also became a witness. And there's a 60-minute show by Mike Wallace back then showing how actually the CIA was even working against the DEA in Venezuela, trying to push, cocaine into Florida. And also talking about narco states, after that, in 2005 is the moment that the Cartel de los Soles reappeared. And it was through a Miami Herald report. And the source who talked about el Cartel de los Soles was basically, they say, was a high-level diplomat in Venezuela. That high-level diplomat in Venezuela, of course, was William Brownfield, U.S. ambassador back then. And it has been an on and off concept they've been using, according to the juncture, ever since, with no actual proof of that kind of structural statewide effort of drug trafficking ever since. This goes back to the Chavez days. Now, and also, yes, one thing it's conspiring and then also indicted for actually smuggling, like they did with Juan Orlando Hernandez, former Honduran president, who actually pushed, and this was proven by the Southern Manhattan courts, that he actually pushed 400 tons of cocaine into Venezuela and into the United States, and he was actually condemned for 45 years in jail. Juan Orlando Hernandez, he was just recently pardoned by President Trump himself within the context of the Honduras election. So what does that tell you about precisely the drugs? So I think it's pretty much counterfactual, and it's not the case. I think it's, one more time, it seemed viable, especially, like I said, procedurally, in the sense that it's easier to face a security, quote unquote, situation than a war with another state. So it was needed to do this paradigm shift, this character assassination, in the sense that we're not fighting dictatorship, we're fighting a crime organization. And this started in 2019 when William Barr actually indicted Maduro with all this, and it has been building up ever since. But this is a practical approach. And yes, I also agree with Mr. David regarding this has to do as well with the national security strategy, the recent one that was released like a week ago. And it also proved that one of the main concerns is precisely Venezuela's engagement, yes, with multipolarity in particular, and especially with the, well, let's call it the three Eurasian players here, Russia, China, and Iran. And yes, they need to close the hemisphere for them, and they need to muster again enough strength in order to actually face the Asian century, specifically China in that sense. And that also, it's something you can see if you know who was the main guy actually in the writing of the strategy. And this is Elbridge Colby, a very well-known China hawk. And this explains that, this does explain that now. It is not only about roughing up countries that are not towing the line in the hemisphere. We see it the other way around as well. We saw what happened in Argentina, the offer of this massive bailout for Javier Milei, for example, or what happened in what is already ongoing in Honduras, and how it started from a Trump Truth Social post defending Juan Orlando Hernandez, supporting the Partido Nacional candidate against the Libre candidate, and how that also helps to shape up the alignment inside the hemisphere. So it is about geopolitics in that sense. And it is ideological also, I might add, to respond to Mr. David, because one thing it's Trump that I do believe that he could go halfway in a negotiation that he could conceive as beneficial. But another thing is, let's call it the late neocon ideas of just reality shaping at will. And I think that it has both things there.
All right, Diego, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. I'd like to thank you both very much indeed for taking part in this discussion about Venezuela. Diego Sequeira, you had the last word. Thank you very much indeed as well to Dr. David Ramadan. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now we're going to head to the Middle East, and as winter storms move in, Gaza's humanitarian crisis is worsening. Well, heavy rains and cold weather have caused heavy flooding across the war-torn strip. After 2 years of warfare, the majority of Palestinians there are now living in tents and makeshift shelters, structures that offer little protection from the rain or the cold. Well, there are already reports of babies dying from hypothermia. Well, as the humanitarian crisis worsens in Gaza, Israel's policies are reshaping reality in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli government has approved the formalization of 19 settlement outposts as independent settlements. That's the third wave of such policies. Well, rights groups warn that settler attacks against Palestinians have forcibly displaced 44 communities across the West Bank during the past 2 years. Well, settlement outposts are considered illegal under international law. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Abbas Dahouk, who is a senior military advisor to the US Department of State and Middle Eastern Affairs. He joins us from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, sir. I'd just like to ask you what your understanding is of where we are in the phased peace process. How close are we to entering phase 2?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I mean, we're currently still obviously in phase 1, and it's being implemented. It's a conditional ceasefire, as you've seen. Hamas still not trusting the Israelis to not to strike at them, and at the same time, Israel still suspicious of every movement Hamas does within its territories. And phase 2 is being implemented. There's a lot of discussions on the characteristics of the International Stabilization Force, on their authorities, and so forth. And you have the president, Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to the U.S. this month, and I think that will be a major discussions on the parameters of phase 2 based on U.S. perhaps conditions and also Israeli conditions, and how to merge these conditions together to be implemented sometime next year.
Right, but when you look at the numbers and you see that since October the 10th, some 380 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. I mean, there are many who say this is a ceasefire in name only. What do you say to that?
Well, it is a conditional ceasefire from the Israeli perspective. It's obviously the intents of the military operations are not the same like the one before the ceasefire. I mean, clearly the operations has decreased. But yes, this is unfortunate. I mean, 400, I think we mentioned, killed thus far during the ceasefire. This is something U.S. government, Trump administration is very concerned about. But at the same time, you look at Israel is looking at its own security interests. And unfortunately, Hamas and the Gaza population are intertwined, and Israel has a high tolerance of collateral damage. So that's why we're seeing that this unfortunate casualties. But yes, those are you can look at them as a violation of ceasefire. But when it comes to security, I think either Hamas securing themselves or Israelis securing themselves, they'll perhaps do the same thing to protect their interests.
But when you read about every person that's killed in Gaza, every child, every person that's orphaned, everyone that's maimed, the amputees, and you think about the generational impact that's going to have on people from Gaza and how they're going to be bearing these psychological scars for generations. I mean, there is a strong argument that Israel's security is undermined with every passing day, given the level of pent-up hatred that must exist the other side of a fence or a border wall. Is that a message you put across to the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. I mean, this, violence begets more violence, and especially between the Israeli and the Palestinians all through history. Violence has not achieved anything on both sides, and it's clearly Israel has the heavy hand in this fight between each other, and there's a lot of innocent lives has been shed on both sides, but mainly on the Palestinian side. I mean, this is the Israelis' decision-making process. It feels like this is something they have to do for one reason or another. But from the U.S. perspective, whether it's this current administration or administration before that, or the U.S. Population writ large, this kind of collateral damage of innocent children, elderly, a woman is not tolerated, and is something Israel has to deal with it in the future as well. So it is tough to do anything about it from the U.S. perspective at this point. But I agree with you. This is something is not good for anybody, especially for the Israeli people and Israeli government.
Let's go back to talking about the ceasefire itself and the deal. When we look at phase one, and I know you say phase one is not yet completed and we're not yet into phase two, but when we look at what's happened so far, so obviously the hostages were released by Hamas. In return, a number of Palestinian detainees have been freed as well. All of the bodies of detainees have been returned with the exception of one, and I gather efforts are ongoing to locate that one deceased captive. Would you say that the Palestinians, so I'm talking here about Hamas, would you say they have fulfilled their side of the deal?
I mean, you still have one holding one deceased hostage, so the deal is not finished yet. But I think this delay in the process here is advantageous for both. Advantageous for the Israeli government and also for Hamas. Both of them are not sure which way they will enter phase two. So I think this is, as you know, releasing the dead hostage should not be an issue. This as easy and it's much easier than having a life hostage or the other hostages. So there's a reason why this is the hostage. I think, from my opinion, Hamas is still holding it, because Hamas also trying to figure out what would happen in phase two. And clearly in phase two, Hamas should not have a role in it. Hamas, they will relinquish their governance. They should be disarmed. And this is something Hamas has not agreed on any of that yet. So we shall wait and see. I mean, both have to do certain things to finish phase one, but Hamas has to do most of the work here. Again, has to disarm itself and has to relinquish governance to the transitional authority that it's coming with phase two.
Right, and we've been told about this board of peace that's going to be set up. President Trump says it'll happen as early as 2026. Well, that's what we've understood. And that kings, presidents and prime ministers will be on that board of peace. I mean, who do you think he's got in mind?
Well, you have the board of peace, and also you have the also transitional authority, and then you have the civil military coordination cell, which is the U.S. presence and the ISF, the International Stabilization Force. So the board of peace is on top of these two different entities, and obviously President Trump, he's very interested in it. He will lead the board, and he has invited European and leaders from the region. So it's kind of unclear who would join that board. But if it's up to President Trump, he will have probably a King of Jordan and maybe a couple of leaders from the GCC countries and a few European leaders as well.
Let's also talk about Israel's side of the bargain here. It's been reported, and we've spoken to a lot of aid workers on the ground who've told us that nothing like enough humanitarian aid, medical aid, is getting through to the people of Gaza who are living in squalid conditions, in makeshift camps, and with winter storms destroying what little dignity they have left. I'm wondering why you think it is that Israel is not allowing adequate humanitarian aid to reach these people who clearly desperately need it.
I think it's two things. One, Israel thinks that, or they were saying some of the aid coming in has dual use, perhaps which will empower Hamas to do their own operations or to empower their authorities inside Gaza. And the second thing also, they feel that as long as Hamas is controlling the aid, Hamas will continue to have the power over the population inside Gaza, and they're calling the shots. And that's something Israel does not want. Israel is using this humanitarian aid, unfortunately, to weaken Hamas. But while they're doing that, at the same time, they're punishing the regular Gaza citizens. So it's a double-edged sword. Israel is looking at punishing Hamas, limiting their authorities in Gaza, but at the same time, the collateral damage is depriving the rest of the population from, like you mentioned, a dire humanitarian aid and need for themselves in terms of food or maybe shelter and some extra articles for this coming winter.
Very hard to put that rationale to a malnourished child in a flooded tent in Gaza.
That's very true. I mean, I understand. It's just if you. What happened is in Israel, I mean, not to justify it, but I was in Israel 30 days ago, and we did cross all the way to the yellow line on the east of Gaza City. And by the way, the yellow line is still a line on the map, has not been identified on the ground yet. Still not sure where the yellow line is going to be. And you do have 53% of Gaza under Israeli control. And Israel is they're looking at their security as number one. And unfortunately, again, we can't justify it. I can't justify it, and you can't justify it. But for the Israeli citizen and for the Israeli decision makers, seems it's a good thing for them to protect their own security and their own safety at all costs, even it's cost the depriving children and elderly from shelter and perhaps food supplies.
But one has to question Israel's motivations whilst talking about the yellow line. When we hear comments like the comments made by the Israeli Army Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, who said that that yellow line will be a new border for Israel. I mean, it sounds like Israel's planning to annex a huge chunk of Gaza.
Well, I think it was clear that this part of Gaza will be demilitarized and for the given future. Israel will not allow the emergence of Hamas in this new east of Gaza, and that eastern part of Gaza, that 50% of Gaza right now that under the Israeli control, will definitely not allow any Hamas presence whatsoever. So is an annexation? I don't think at this point, perhaps it's a wishful thinking for the Israelis. I mean, the United States, I don't think will support something like this at the moment. But the Israeli government and the Israeli people, they feel that they need to contain Gaza. What happened on October 6th was devastating. The first time ever war will enter inside Israeli territory. Most of the Arab Israeli wars were out in Arab territories. This one, the first time inside their territories. And they have to, the Israeli government has to prove to its citizens that they are secure, and they will not allow to allow Hamas that close to their to their settlements. So at this point, it's occupied territories. Will it be annexed or not? It's not part of Phase 2. It's not part of the peace plan that President Trump put forward. So we'll just have to wait and see.
And just lastly, another issue that makes me question where things are heading to from here. We're told that the Rafah border crossing, which connects Gaza to Egypt, could at some stage in the not too distant future reopen, but only for one-way traffic, i.e. people leaving Gaza but no one coming back in again. I mean, doesn't that raise a bit of a red flag?
There is a red flag for sure, but that's something also, this is part of the negotiations. This is something Israel also uses as a token for negotiations. And as also a carrot, like we say in the diplomatic talk. They're not flexible at this point, but with discussions and with the clear focus on Phase 2 or new conditions, that could be eased up a little bit. But at this point, Israel is very strict. Will not allow anybody to enter, and not allow to bring any weapons or anything like that through borders. And this is something Israel border control is very important part of Phase 2. They want guarantees from the United States and others that those borders will be controlled very tightly.
Okay, well, we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Abbas Dahouk, Senior Military Advisor to the US Department of State, Middle East Affairs. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you for having me.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.